They asked me what it was like. Young ones mostly. Press corps, government handlers, kids in uniform who weren't born yet when it started. They want to know what it felt like to be there, to be one of the four. And every time I open my mouth to answer, I look down at my hands and the answer gets complicated. I have not had human hands in a long time. You get used to things, they tell you. You adapt. That's the human advantage, the biologists say on the news panels, the thing that makes us worth rooting for. I never argue. I just sit in whatever chair hasn't broken under me yet, and I wait for them to finish their sentences, and I think about Reed. I think about Sue. I think about Johnny. And I think about what we did in the shadow of that thing's castle when none of us were sure the sun was going to come up the next morning. This is what I remember. This is how it happened. I met Reed Richards in the autumn of the year I turned 22, which was unremarkable except that it was the year everything started, even if none of us knew it at the time. Reed was a graduate student in astrophysics. I was the guy who flew the department's test glider as a work-study job, and we became friends the way men do when they're both too stubborn to admit they're lonely, slowly. Then all at once, over bad coffee and argument. He was the most irritating human being I had ever encountered and probably the most brilliant. And those two qualities, I would learn, had a way of arriving together. He thought in ways that made other people tired. Not because he was showing off. Reed had no interest in showing off, but because the connections he made between things were so densely packed that following his reasoning felt like hiking uphill. He would start a sentence about orbital mechanics and end it with an observation about cooking that turned out, if you followed the logic all the way back, to be mathematically related to the orbital mechanics in a way you couldn't argue with. He was the kind of person who made you feel both more intelligent and more aware of your limitations in the same conversation. And if that sounds like a frustrating quality in a friend, it is, and I wouldn't trade it. He had a friend, Victor von Doom. I always thought that name was too theatrical for a real person, but Victor was theatrical in most things. Handsome, European, sharp in a way that cut before you noticed you were bleeding. He and Reed were competitive the way brothers are competitive, with love underneath and genuine fury on top. They had a theory together about a phenomenon they called the Colossus event, a comet-borne energy surge that passed through our solar system on a long orbital cycle, and they wanted to tap it, harness it, translate its radiation into something usable. The experiment went wrong. I wasn't there. I heard it secondhand from Reed, who was white-faced and barely speaking for 3 days. There was a discharge, unexpected, violent, the kind of thing that should have killed both of them. Reed walked away with a sunburn and nightmares. Victor walked away with something considerably worse. The scarring was extensive. It went beyond what flesh should be able to absorb and keep the person intact. He disappeared from the university that winter. Reed spent the next decade convinced his friend was dead, and spent every hour of those 10 years trying to make good on the work they'd started together. I know now that Victor was not dead. I know now what he spent those 10 years doing instead, but we'll get to that. The four of us came together the way teams always come together, not by design, but because the problem got big enough that any one person couldn't hold it alone. Reed needed a pilot for the mission. I was the best available. Sue Storm, who had known Reed since she was a girl, her mother had run the boarding house where he rented a room during his dissertation, was lead researcher on the energy containment team. Her brother Johnny had no formal credentials that would have passed any normal vetting process, but he could fly. He was fearless to the point of recklessness, and Sue vouched for him. I didn't like him much in the beginning. I came around. The mission was straightforward in the way that only sounds straightforward from a distance. Rendezvous with the Colossus phenomenon in low orbit, record its energy signature at range, collect radiation samples via unmanned probe. The theory was that this time, with 10 more years of calculation and a purpose-built collector array, they'd get the data Reed had been chasing without anyone getting hurt. The launch went clean. I remember the way the atmosphere thinned below us and the black came in at the edges, gradual and then total, and how even after dozens of flights it still did something to the chest to see the curve of the earth laid out underneath, you like something a god might look at while deciding whether to keep it. We never reached the rendezvous coordinate. The Colossus was not what the models predicted. It wasn't a comet. It wasn't a natural phenomenon. We understood that in the first 30 seconds of contact, when the sensors started reading geometries that natural radiative bodies do not produce, and Reed went very still in the way he got when something was both terrifying and fascinating at the same time. The object that hit us was not random energy. It was directed. It was, in some sense we still argue about in the academic literature, intentional. The hull lost integrity. All four of us were hit. The last thing I remember before the blackout was the sound of Sue's voice saying Reed's name, and then nothing, and then a long time of nothing, and then the return atmosphere burn that felt like being pressed flat by a giant's palm, and then ground. They found us 3 days later. One of the emergency transponders had survived the re-entry, and a search team from the recovery base got to us before the exposure could finish what the Colossus started. Reed was alive. Sue was alive. Johnny was alive. I was alive, which in the weeks that followed I would not always be certain was a blessing. The changes were not immediate. They came on slowly like a tide. Reed noticed his first, the way his fingers could extend past their natural range when he reached for something, more than was possible, far more, and then retract as if nothing had happened. He said nothing for 2 days. He's like that. He turns a problem in his mind until he has a complete theory, and only then does he say it out loud, because in his view an incomplete theory is more dangerous than silence. Sue's change was different. She would be in the room and then somehow not be in the room and then be back, and she couldn't explain it except to say that she had been thinking very hard about not wanting to be seen. The first time she generated a field, a hard, curved wall of force between herself and the lab bench when an experiment ran away from her. She stood and looked at it for a long time without speaking and then said, very quietly, "Oh, just that." Johnny's change announced itself the way Johnny announced most things, loud, visible, and at the worst possible moment. He had been complaining about feeling overheated for a week. One night in the recovery facility, he woke the entire floor when his bed sheets caught fire, and he was standing in the center of the room, entirely unhurt, entirely on fire, staring at his own hands with an expression I can only describe as delighted. He was 21 years old. Of course he was delighted. Mine was the hardest to look at. I understood that from the faces of the medical staff, who had years of training in not showing what they were feeling and showed it anyway. The physical change had been complete by the time I regained full consciousness. The thing in the mirror was not what I was used to. The word they eventually settled on for what I had become was imprecise but sufficient. I was harder, denser. The cells had restructured themselves into something with the tensile properties of industrial stone, layered in a way that had no natural precedent. I could not be cut by anything they tried. I could not be burned. My strength was not something anyone had a good unit of measurement for, because I kept exceeding the capacity of their instruments. I was strong in the way a geological event is strong, not aggressive, not fast, just implacable. I spent 3 weeks not looking in mirrors after that. 3 weeks of Reed talking to me through the door of whatever room I'd taken myself to, his voice patient, not pitying, telling me what the science said, what the data suggested, what the possibilities were. I didn't want possibilities. I wanted my hands back. I wanted the face my mother had known. I wanted a cup of coffee that I wasn't terrified of crushing in my grip. You don't know what you are until you are asked to be it, without the form you started in. That's not wisdom I sought out. It's something the situation handed me and I had to find a use for or drown in. There were men I knew, other pilots, men I'd served with who came and sat outside the room at various points in those weeks, not saying much, just being there, showing up. That was a kindness. I didn't have language for it at the time. I have language for it now. The kindness of people who don't have a solution, but who understand that the worst thing you can do to someone in a bad place is leave them in it alone. Reed waited me out. He's good at that. Then one morning he sat across from me at the mess table and he said, "Ben, something is coming." And I looked at him and he looked at me, and I understood that the next part of this was not going to be about me at all. Not only about me. He had been reconstructing what had happened to the Colossus event data. He had been thinking and measuring and reading and making connections. And the connection he had made was this. The energy source that had changed us was not random, and it was not alone. The orbital geometry, the directed nature of the exposure, the way our bodies had been changed in ways that were not accidental but specifically, functionally useful. These were not the products of a natural phenomenon. They were the products of something that had plans. We didn't know Victor was alive yet. That came later. What Reed knew in those early weeks was that something had been watching us, something vast and patient and not human, and it was already here. They called them the architects. I don't know who named them first. The name spread through the military and intelligence channels before anyone had a clear picture of what they were, and by the time the picture got clear, the name had stuck. Architects. It was, in a grim way, accurate. They built. That was what they did, what they had always done, what the deep orbital surveys eventually confirmed they had been doing on 6 other worlds across this arm of the galaxy before they found ours. They arrived and they assessed and they calculated and then they rebuilt, reshaped. The surface geology, the atmospheric chemistry, the existing biosphere, all of it reformed according to geometries that made sense only from a perspective of pure mathematical elegance, with no concern whatsoever for what had been living there before. They were not aggressive in the way we think of aggression. There was no hatred in them, no malice. They would no more hate us than you hate the grass you level before you lay a foundation. We were, in their calculations, a prior structure to be cleared, an inefficiency in the substrate, a variable to be resolved. The thing that made them genuinely terrifying, more terrifying than their scale, more terrifying than the indifference, was the patience. They did not rush. They had never needed to rush. On every world the surveys had catalogued, the process had run to completion at whatever rate the local conditions permitted, and the local conditions had always, eventually, permitted. There were no failed engagements in their record, no worlds that had held out, no civilizations that had adapted fast enough. They had been at this since before our sun formed, and they had not yet encountered a reason to adjust their timeline for anyone. The first architect structure appeared outside the ruins of what had been a mid-sized European city. Not a ship exactly, not a building. Something between the two, a complex of interlocking angular forms in a dark mineral composite that had no natural equivalent in Earth's crust, rising from ground level to a height that put its upper sections above most of the cloud layer. Perfect right angles, perfect ratios. The kind of beauty that makes you cold, because it has no room in it for anything warm. Within 6 months, there were 11 such structures on 4 continents. Within a year, the number had passed 40, and the major governments had stopped publishing the updated count, because the updated count was not helping anyone's morale. The military engaged them, of course. The military engages everything. Conventional munitions were absorbed or redirected. Heavier ordnance bought time days, sometimes not weeks, before the architects simply rebuilt around the damage. They communicated after a fashion. Mathematical sequences in radio frequencies, in modulated light, in ground vibrations. The meaning, once the linguists and mathematicians had spent a year with it, was not ambiguous. They were not interested in negotiation. They were not interested in our survival as a distinct category of entity. They were interested in the efficient completion of their work. The engagement reports made for grim reading. The pilots and soldiers and crews who went in against the structures were not cowards. They were the best we had, trained to a standard that would have been exceptional against any conventional adversary. They did everything right. The structures did not care. A force that doesn't care is different from a force that is simply more powerful. Against a more powerful enemy, there are pressure points, costs that can be imposed, calculations that can be changed. Against a force that simply does not register the imposition of costs, you are fighting the tide. The tide does not negotiate. Our losses in the first 18 months were significant, not catastrophic. The architects were not interested in destroying us specifically, only in proceeding with their work, and their work advanced methodically outward from the established structure sites in ways that were predictable if not preventable. But the population relocations, the loss of infrastructure, the compounding economic and logistical strain of maintaining any kind of coherent response, these were their own kind of attrition. You don't need to kill a civilization to end it. You can simply make it untenable. Reed sat with that translation for a long time. Then he said, "We have advantages they haven't accounted for." This was how he always started. Not with fear, not with despair, not with the political speeches about humanity's indomitable spirit that the government kept issuing from whatever secure location the government had retreated to that week. Just, we have advantages they haven't accounted for, as if it were a math problem, as if the solution were already somewhere in the numbers, waiting to be found. I believed him, not because I understood all of his reasoning, because I had watched him sit across from the worst news of his professional life and treat it as a data set. I had watched Sue stand in a hospital corridor after the changes set in and look at the impossible things she could do and say, "Oh," and start figuring out what it meant. I had watched Johnny, who had never been serious about anything in his life, grow quiet and focused in a way that reminded me of pilots I had known. The ones who stayed calm when the airframe was coming apart, who saved everyone else by being willing to do the thing no one else would do. I had watched myself stop flinching at the mirror. There is a version of this story where I tell you about the politics and the command structures and the weeks of briefings and the months of preparation. I could tell you all of it, but the part that matters, the part that changed anything, was not in any of the briefings. It was in what the four of us had become and what we were willing to do with it. Victor made contact 6 weeks before the Latveria operation. He sent a message through channels he had no legitimate access to, which told us several things at once about what he had been doing since we'd believed him dead. The message reached Reed directly, and Reed came to the rest of us with it that same night. Victor was alive. Victor had spent the past decade not grieving his own disfigurement but building on it, acquiring resources, acquiring technology, acquiring influence in the power structures that were already operating in the margins of the crisis, the ones who saw the architects not as an extinction event but as leverage. He had a castle in Latveria, in the mountain country. He had followers, arms, and a working prototype of a directed energy cannon of considerable scale. He also had a piece of the Colossus, a crystalline fragment that had come down in the same retrieval corridor as our craft, that his people had recovered before any government agency got there. According to his own data, the crystal was the key to the laser cannon's range and power. Without it, the weapon was an oversized laboratory curiosity. With it aimed at the main architect structure outside what was left of the nearest major population center, it would produce an effect comparable to a significant geological event at the target site. Reed was quiet for a long time after he finished reading. I said, "He's going to use it on the city." "Yes," Reed said. "Because the main structure is adjacent to the population zone, and he doesn't see that as a complication." Apparently not. We all sat with that for a moment. Outside the facility windows, the sky to the east had the faint luminescent quality it had developed over the past months. The architect's structures put off a light pollution in the mineral spectrum that didn't behave like light from any natural source. You got used to it, the way you got used to most things you couldn't change, but it never stopped being wrong. "So we have to stop him too," Johnny said. He wasn't smiling. He had his arms folded on the table in front of him, and he was looking at the surface of the table with the flat expression he got when he was thinking hard, the one that still surprised me because it didn't match the face people expected to see on him. "Same trip. We go to the castle, we take the diamond, we keep the cannon from firing. And we deal with the main architect structure before his shot clears the problem for him by destroying everything in a 12-kilometer radius, Sue said. Yes to all of it, Reed said. Any of us have a plan for that last part? Reed looked at me. I looked at Reed. We had been friends for long enough that we could have a fairly complete conversation without saying anything. We'll figure it out when we get there, I said. Sue put her face in her hands briefly. Then she raised it again and said, All right, when do we leave? The road to Latveria was not the kind of road you take in a standard vehicle. The architects had been at work on the infrastructure of the lowlands for months, and what had been transit corridors were now something else, partially restructured, angular. The geometry of the landscape altered in ways that felt like a visual migraine if you looked at them too long. Their preference was for mineral density and angular precision, and they imposed it on whatever surface they worked on. The trees along the route were gone. The soil was compressed into aggregate. The bridges had been restructured into load-bearing forms that were more efficient than anything humans had built, but that looked, from underneath, like the inside of a machine. Reed drove. He liked driving. He said it helped him think. Sue was in the passenger seat with a tablet full of structural data on the castle layout that Victor had not known we had. Johnny was in the back, quiet, which I had learned to interpret as a sign that he was serious. I took up most of the remaining space in the vehicle and tried to be less aware of my own weight than usual. We talked about what we knew. Victor had approximately 40 armed personnel in the castle compound, defectors, former military, some private contractors, men who had decided that in the current situation the most sensible allegiance was to whoever had a plan. Victor had a plan. That was not nothing these days. The cannon was housed in the lower compound, in a structure built into the mountain's foundation. The crystal, the piece of the Colossus, was in the primary lab, which occupied the castle's upper level. Reed could not confirm exactly how much time we had before Victor attempted his shot, but the energy readings from Victor's own data suggested the cannon was close to full charge. Days, not weeks. And the main architect structure was 9 kilometers from the castle's outer wall, and growing. I had seen them up close once before. The structures. I had been part of a reconnaissance deployment 6 months earlier, before the 4 of us had started working together as a unit, when I was still attached to a conventional military element, and the generals were still trying conventional things. We had gone in to photograph and record from ground level, the sort of mission that sounds straightforward until you are standing in the shadow of a thing so large that it affects local weather, and you are trying to remember that it is not looking at you because it does not have eyes, and it does not care about you because you are not yet a structure it needs to interact with. The architects themselves were rarely visible. The structures moved and adapted and grew, but the things inside them, the entities driving the process, were almost never observed in any form you could look at directly. When they were visible, they appeared as dense, dark, vaguely polyhedral masses of the same mineral composite as their buildings, edged with geometric ridges, moving with a deliberate, slow certainty. They had no apparent sensory organs that corresponded to anything in terrestrial biology. They communicated through vibration and field geometry. They felt no pain that any of our instruments could detect. They had never, in any engagement, retreated. Not once. They did not understand why anything would. That was the thing I kept coming back to in the long nights before Latveria, not the size of them, not the indifference, the fact that retreat was simply not in their model. A human army, no matter how outmatched, has a retreat condition, a point at which the calculus of survival overrides everything else. Evolution spent a very long time building that instinct into us. The architects did not have it. They had calculated the optimal outcome and were executing the path to it, and no intermediate resistance had yet given them cause to revise the calculation. Reed believed that was a vulnerability. I was inclined to agree. There is a difference between certainty and correctness, and the gap between them is where wars get decided. We reached the outer approaches of the castle compound after dark, which was intentional. Whatever advantages we had, subtlety was among them, at least for three of us. The compound was perimeter lit with industrial floods, and the guard positions were heavy but not well staggered. Victor had built for the architects, not for us. He had not anticipated us. Sue went first. I won't try to explain exactly what she does when she goes invisible, because I have watched it hundreds of times and I still cannot make it mechanical in my mind. It is not a trick of light exactly, though it involves light. It is more like she makes a decision about whether the universe is allowed to see her, and the universe, faced with Sue Storm's absolute quiet certainty about things, generally complies. She was through the outer perimeter in 8 minutes, and the side entrance was open 12 minutes after that. We moved through the castle the way Reed had planned, Reed and Sue together through the interior, Johnny holding the outer perimeter, and ready to move the moment any alarm went up, and me directly to the lower compound, the cannon room, because if Victor's people decided to accelerate the timeline, the cannon was the only thing that needed to be stopped, and stopping things was something I was reasonably well suited for. Victor's men found me before I found the cannon. 4 of them in the lower corridor, with weapons that were impressive against human-scale targets. I am not, currently, a human-scale target in the way those weapons were designed to address. I was sorry about the corridor. It was old stonework and it had probably survived several hundred years before I came through it, and it did not survive me. The cannon room was below the main foundation, carved into the mountain, and the cannon itself was larger than the briefing materials had suggested. It occupied most of the space, a directed energy projector of considerable engineering sophistication, aimed through a bore cut directly through the mountain's face at a downward angle that would bring the beam to bear on the architect's structure at the bottom of the valley. The crystal sat in a housing at the cannon's focal point, pulsing with a light that was not quite any color I had a name for. The same light I had seen from the Colossus event, 10 years compressed, held in a piece of rock no larger than my fist. I took it out of the housing. The cannon's charge indicators dropped immediately to critical minimum. I was still holding the crystal when Victor found me. He had come alone, which told me something about him. He was in his armor, the kind of full-plate composite that you build when you have a decade of private resources and excellent engineering talent and a personal investment in never being vulnerable again. The face was masked, but I knew the voice. Reed had played me recordings. "Ben Grimm," he said. "Victor," I said. "You've been sent to stop me, not a question." "Nobody sent me. I came on my own, and yes." He was quiet for a moment, looking at me in the way people look at me, cataloging the changes, adjusting their model. I am aware of how I look. I have made my peace with it mostly. "The cannon was the answer," he said. "You understand that. The structure in the valley has been growing for 8 months. At its current rate of expansion, it reaches this compound in 6 weeks. Beyond that, this entire mountain range is substrate for the next phase of their construction. The laser would have stopped it, along with everything else in the blast radius." "Acceptable losses," he said, flat, certain. "They don't process acceptable losses. They process optimal outcomes. We have to be willing to do what they won't do." I thought about that. I thought about it seriously, the way it deserved to be thought about, because Victor was not a stupid man and his frustration was real, and the situation was exactly as desperate as he was treating it. The architects had no acceptable loss threshold because they had no losses. They processed setbacks as calculation errors to be corrected, not as wounds to be grieved. To beat them with their own mathematics was tempting. "You'd kill everyone in the impact zone to save the mountain range," I said. "And the architects will adapt. They'll recalculate. And you'll need a bigger shot next time, and more people will be in the blast radius, and you'll calculate that those losses are acceptable too. And at what point are you different from them?" He came at me then, which was perhaps inevitable. Victor was formidable in that armor. I had been told he was formidable. He was fast, precise, trained to a standard that most human combatants would not reach in several lifetimes, and the composite he wore could absorb and redirect force in ways that made him genuinely dangerous to most things he would encounter. He was not quite what I would call dangerous to me, but it was not a comfortable conversation either. We went through 2 more sections of the lower compound before I got a hold on him that he could not engineer his way out of, and we stopped. "I'm going to take the crystal," I said. "We're going to do this another way." He was breathing hard, so was I, which was more of a surprise to me than it should have been. "There is no other way," he said. "Reed thinks there is." There was a silence, and then, in a different voice, older, quieter, something like the voice of the man he had been before the scarring, before the decade of building and planning and fury. "Reed is always sure there's another way. He usually finds one." Another silence. Above us, through the stone, I could hear sounds that suggested Johnny had started being loud in the perimeter, which meant the schedule had accelerated. "If he's wrong," Victor said, "you've condemned this region and everything in it." "If you're wrong," I said, "you've condemned everyone in the blast zone and this region and everything in it anyway. At least Reed's wrong quietly." I left him there, not comfortable, not happy, but contained. I had the crystal. I had the crystal, and I had very limited time, and I needed to find Reed. The architect's structure had extended a processing tendril to the base of the mountain while we were inside. I could see it from the upper compound when I came out, a slow, methodical extrusion of the mineral composite, dark and precise, moving with the unhurried certainty of something that had never had to hurry. It had not reached the compound perimeter yet. It would, by Reed's estimate, reach it before morning. Reed was in the upper lab. He had been there since Sue had gotten him through, and he had been thinking and working in the way he worked when the problem was the kind of problem that made most people stop thinking, with increasing focus, with fewer words, with the particular stillness he got when he was close to something. The lab was Victor's, full of Victor's work, and Reed moved through it with the efficiency of a man reading in his native language. Sue was watching the windows. The luminescence from the structure below had increased. It had a quality now of attention, though I could not have defended that description scientifically. It felt like attention. "The crystal," Reed said, and held out his hand without looking up from the bench. I gave it to him. He turned it in his fingers with the delicate care he reserved for things that might break, which, given what the crystal had already survived, seemed like an unnecessary precaution, but Reed was like that. "Tell me," I said. "The Colossus event changed us," he said. "All 4 of us, specifically. Not randomly, the changes were functional. Mine gives me reach and flexibility. Sue's gives her the ability to be unseen and to project a barrier. Johnny's gives him fire and light. Yours gives you the capacity to absorb and resist force." He looked up. "These are not random mutations, Ben. These are responses. The event was not an accident. Something, or some process connected to the Colossus itself, responded to the presence of 4 human beings in a specific way." "Responded how?" Sue said. "By creating the optimal set of capabilities to address a threat that it had already calculated." He set the crystal down on the bench. "The architects have been doing this for a very long time, across multiple worlds, and every world they've processed completely, except one." He told us what the data said. The one exception, the single world in the survey record where the architects had begun their work, and then, according to their own transmitted records, withdrawn, was not a world with better weapons. It was not a world with a larger military or a more sophisticated deterrent. It was a world whose biology, faced with the arrival of the architects, had adapted, not in the sense of evolving over generations. In the sense of responding immediately, specifically, in ways that the architect processing models could not integrate into a solvable calculation. The architects had encountered a biological system that didn't respond to their stimuli in predictable ways, and rather than persist with an unsolvable calculation, they had flagged the system as anomalous and moved on. They process optimal outcomes, Reed said. They don't persist against variables they can't model. That's not inefficiency, it's how their system is designed. They never needed to develop the capacity to persist through the unmodelable because they've never encountered it before. And we're going to give them something unmodelable, Sue said. We already are, Reed said. He looked at the crystal again. This isn't just a power source, it's a communication medium. The Colossus is connected to the architect network, or it was before the fragment came down with us. If I can use it to introduce a calculation error at the source level of the structure's processing architecture. In plain language, I said. He took a breath. I can talk to it. I can give it a problem it can't solve. But to do that, someone has to be inside the structure when I transmit. The crystal's range is short. The field it produces decays rapidly over distance. Someone has to carry it into the structure and hold position while I work. I looked at the crystal, I looked at my hands. I'll go, I said. The processing field inside those structures is considerable, Reed said. It would be lethal to normal tissue. To your tissue, he paused. Probable survival with significant disruption to the restructured cell matrix. That's a long way around saying maybe. It's an accurate description of what the math says. Okay, I said. So maybe I make it and maybe I don't. What happens if I make it? If you maintain position for approximately 4 minutes while I transmit through the crystal, the error propagates through the local processing nodes, and the structure enters an anomaly loop it can't resolve. It flags this location as unmodelable. It withdraws. And if it doesn't work? Reed looked at me steadily. Then we'll know I was wrong. All right, I picked up the crystal. It was warm against what passed for my skin. The color in it was moving, alive in some way that wasn't easy to look at directly. What are the 4 minutes going to feel like? He was quiet for a moment. Then, I don't know. I appreciated the honesty. Johnny was outside when I came through the compound doors, standing on the outer wall with his arms slightly spread, and a corona of light around him that had nothing to do with the compound's floods. He had been keeping Victor's perimeter people busy, and the evidence of that was scattered across the outer courtyard in the form of melted weapon housings and scorched patterns on the stonework. He looked at me when I came out. He looked at the crystal. His face was the face of a man who had been doing hard work and was not done yet and knew it. That's the plan, he said. That's the plan. He nodded once. What do you need from me? When I go in, I said, they're going to notice. The structure's going to respond. I need you to make sure that response is aimed at something it can't process fast enough to stop me reaching the center. He looked at the structure below in the valley, at the dark mineral mass of it lit from within by the cold geometric light. And he was quiet for a moment in the way he got quiet when he was about to do something that he knew he probably should be afraid of and wasn't. You know, he said, when I was a kid, I used to think the worst thing that could happen to you was being ordinary, being the person who didn't matter, who nothing happened to. He paused. I was a very stupid kid. You grew out of it, I said. He smiled. It was a real smile, not the performance he used on strangers. Mostly, go on, I'll keep it busy. Before I left, I checked on Victor one more time. He was where I had left him, which suggested he had made a decision or was still making one. There was a long silence between us in the lower compound room with the dead cannon, and then he said very quietly, "If this doesn't work, Grim, you have condemned more people than my shot would have." And I said, "I know. That's going to sit on me for the rest of my life if I'm wrong. But the shot was going to sit on you too, and you'd already made your peace with it, and I'm not built that way." He didn't answer that. I didn't expect him to. I was not trying to win an argument. I was just being honest, the way you are with someone you're about to leave behind in an uncertain situation, because it might be the last honest exchange you get. What followed is hard to put in sequence, because sequence stopped making sense partway through. I can give you the pieces. I went down the mountain toward the structure. The tendril of composite material had reached the base of the slope by then, and the main body of the structure rose before me in the valley like a city turned on its side, all angles and in tension, lit from within by the process that never stopped. The ground near it had been reshaped, the soil compressed and realigned, the natural topography replaced by something more efficient. Nothing grew within several hundred meters of the outer wall. The air had a quality of weight to it, pressure without wind, the signature of the field the structure generated in continuous operation. Walking toward it, I had time to think about all the things I had told myself I would think about if I ever had 4 uninterrupted minutes with nothing to do but hold still and be present. The things you defer because the present is always too loud, and the deferred things are always quieter than the noise. You defer them long enough and they become background, not resolved, just accommodated. I had a lot of accommodated things. I was carrying them towards something that would either change the calculation or confirm that the calculation was final. And either way, I thought, it was time to stop accommodating and start deciding what I actually believed. I believed Reed was right. That was what I came down to, not because I understood all the physics, because I knew the man, and the man had never yet brought me a theory he wasn't sure of, and his certainty had a different texture than hope. Hope has a trembling in it. Reed's certainty was quiet and flat and patient, the same way he was quiet and flat and patient when he was waiting for you to finish the question you couldn't quite articulate so he could answer it. I could feel the crystal getting warmer in my hand, or I was getting warmer. It was difficult to separate the two. Johnny hit it from the southwest, which was the angle with the best approach vector, and also, I suspected, the angle with the most spectacular visual effect. I did not see the beginning of it because I was already moving through the lower approaches of the structure's outer surface, looking for a way through a wall that was designed to have no ways through it. What I had was the simple physical fact that I could push against things that did not move for anyone else, and I applied that fact until there was a way. Inside the structure was nothing like inside a building. It was nothing like inside anything I had a prior frame for. The interior geometry was not architectural in any sense that corresponded to the housing of beings. There were no rooms, no corridors in the human sense, no spaces proportioned for movement or occupancy. It was all function. Structure supporting structure, mineral lattice interlocked in patterns that carried load and processed energy, and communicated in frequencies I couldn't hear but could feel in the modified bone structure of my chest. The light was everywhere and from no direction. The heat was considerable. The scale of it did something to your sense of perspective that I still have trouble articulating. Outside, the structure was incomprehensibly large. Inside, it was larger than the outside suggested it should be, which should have been physically impossible and probably was, by the rules of physics that applied to natural things. The rules here were not those rules. The architects had been engineering matter and energy for longer than our species had been thinking about matter and energy, and the interior of their work was a demonstration of that in every direction you looked. The lattice walls carried information the way nervous tissue carries signals. It was running, continuously, and you were inside the process, and the process did not care about you except as a variable it had not yet resolved. I thought, moving through it, this is what the world looks like to something that doesn't have the limitation of needing to be somewhere in particular. No up or down in the way those words meant to a creature standing on gravity. No inside or outside in the way those words meant to something that lived in spaces. Just function, in every direction, continuously. The crystal was warm. The warmth was spreading up my arm, into the structure of my chest, and it was not comfortable but it was purposeful. The way the ache in a joint before rain is purposeful. Your body telling you something about the conditions around you through channels older than language. I moved toward the center. I knew which direction it was, the way you know things in a fever dream, not by reasoning it out, but by some direct perception that bypassed the usual logic. The crystal was navigating, or I was following the crystal. The distinction didn't hold up under examination. They became aware of me somewhere in the second minute. I know this because the geometry changed. The lattice walls around me began to shift and close, the architect's equivalent of an immune response, the structure trying to resolve the variable that had entered its interior. Forms that I cannot describe accurately began to converge. Dark, angular, dense in a way that had nothing to do with ordinary mass. They did not make sound. They communicated through the vibration of the material around them. And what I felt in my chest from that communication was not anything I would call language, but it carried the unmistakable structure of a calculation being run. They were running the calculation for what I was and what I would do and how to resolve my presence. They were wrong. I was not a resolvable variable. That was the point. That was what Reed had understood from the data, not that we were stronger than them, not that we had better weapons, but that we were the category of thing their system had not built in a resolution path for. A body that was organic but stone. A woman who was there and not there simultaneously. A young man who was also a fire that followed its own rules. A scientist who could reach into any problem and find the part of it that wasn't finished being discovered yet. None of these things computed. None of them mapped onto the processing models. The calculation kept returning anomaly flags, and the anomaly flags kept accumulating, and the system kept trying to run a resolution that wasn't there. 4 minutes, Reed had said. I held position. I held the crystal. The forms closed around me, and the field they generated applied itself to my body with a force I have not got a human unit of measurement for, and I held. My structure was disrupted in the ways Reed had said it would be. Some of the disruption was significant. I held. There is a thing that happens when you are in a situation where dying is a real possibility, and you have made your peace with it as best you can. Time doesn't slow down the way people in movies say it slows down. It doesn't accelerate either. It becomes something else, not fast or slow, but very precise, each moment distinct and clear, the way a very cold morning makes edges sharp. I was aware of the crystal in my hand. I was aware of the field pressing against the restructured cells of my body. I was aware, somewhere above and to the west, of the specific quality of light that was Johnny, not the fire, which you can see from a distance, but the thing behind the fire, the something that was Johnny Storm before it was anything else. The kid who was afraid of being ordinary and then found out the universe had extremely specific plans for him that had nothing to do with ordinary. I was aware of the processing forms around me attempting their calculation, and of the calculation not completing, and of the system attempting it again, differently, and the new attempt not completing either. And I was aware of myself, which was not something I was always comfortable being. I thought about Ben Grimm at 22. The pilot, the worksteady glider jockey, the guy who became friends with the most irritating person in the department because they were both too stubborn to admit they needed someone to argue with. I thought about the face in the mirror, the one I still missed on some mornings. I thought about what Reed had said once in the third week after the changes set in, when I had finally asked him what he thought had actually happened to me, what the science really said, underneath all the hopeful framing. You weren't destroyed, Ben. You were restructured. Everything you were is still there. It's just that now it's also this. I was still thinking about that when the 4 minutes finished. Above me, through the composite walls, I could feel the heat of Johnny. Not the temperature, but the fact of him. The way a fire is more than combustion. The way what he had become was not just a body that burned, but something the architect's models had never encountered and could not enumerate. He was not attacking the structure. Not exactly. He was being himself at it, which is the only way I know to describe what Johnny does when he stops performing and just exists. And then the 4 minutes were done. I know they were done because the crystal went cold in my hand, and the forms around me stopped moving, and there was a change in the vibration of the structure, not a shutdown, not a collapse, but a pause, a calculation interrupting itself, a system reaching a state it did not have a next step for. Then slowly, it began to withdraw. Not to collapse, not to die in any sense that matched that word. The architects do not die in the way living things die. They calculate, and when the calculation cannot complete, they flag the input as anomalous and remove it from the active workset. This system, this structure, this 9-kilometer complex of mineral geometry and cold certainty, it flagged us. Flagged the mountain, the compound, the valley, this small piece of unremarkable European geography, where 4 changed human beings had stood their ground and refused to be solved for. The tendril retracted. The structure's outer sections began to draw inward. In the valley, slowly, something that had taken 8 months to grow began 8 months of leaving. I sat down on the interior floor of the structure, which was already becoming less interior as the walls drew back around me, and I waited for Reed's voice in my earpiece, and when it came it said, "Ben, are you intact?" I thought about that for a moment. "Define intact," I said. He laughed. He doesn't laugh often, it's not a performance with Reed. It's a real thing that comes out when the calculation completes, and the answer is better than expected. I had heard that laugh maybe 15 times in all the years I had known him. This was one of the 15. "Get out of there," he said. "The structure is going to be unstable as the withdrawal proceeds." I got out. The sun came up over the mountains while the structure was still retreating, and the light it threw across the valley was ordinary, warm and directional and comprehensible, the kind of light that had no geometry in it, no intention, just the old simple fact of a star illuminating a planet. Johnny was sitting on a rock outcropping above the valley with his arms on his knees, watching the withdrawal, looking tired in the way he looked when he had been burning for a long time. Sue was beside him with one hand on his shoulder, which was a significant gesture for Sue, who was precise about contact. Reed was standing a few meters away with his tablet, recording everything, because Reed would record his own funeral if there was data to be gathered from it. I went and sat near Johnny on the rock, which creaked under me in the way rocks sometimes do. I watched the structure withdrawing in the early light. "Is it going to come back?" Johnny asked. "Reed says no," I said. "This location is flagged. In their system, this place doesn't resolve. They'll root around it." "The other structures?" "Not yet. This was one location. But the calculation error propagates through the network. Reed's working on what that means for the rest. He thinks it's the first domino." Johnny nodded slowly. He was quiet for a while. The valley below us was beginning to look like a valley again. The compressed aggregate was already cracking at the edges where the architect's field had withdrawn, the first indication that whatever was under it was still there, still patient, still capable of coming back. Grass takes time, but grass comes back. "Ben," he said. "Yeah." "What are you going to do after?" I thought about the question. It was a real question, the kind that deserved a real answer, and I turned it over for a moment the way you do when the person asking it is someone you've come through something large with, and their curiosity carries weight. "I don't know," I said. "Keep going, I guess, be what I am." He didn't say anything to that. He didn't need to. The retreat of that first structure was confirmed by satellite within 48 hours. Reed's transmission had propagated through the architect network in ways that even he was still mapping months later. The other structures showed anomalous behavior patterns within days, and over the following year, one by one, in the slow, deliberate way they had arrived, they withdrew. Not all at once. Not without pain, not without loss, not without the long, hard work of people in other places who fought their own versions of the same fight with the tools they had. But the calculation had been disrupted at the source, and a system built on the premise of perfect resolution had encountered something it could not perfectly resolve, and it had done what its design required. It had moved on. Victor disappeared from the castle before the governments arrived to secure the compound. No one ever confirmed where he went. Reed received one more message, months later, brief, no return path. It said only, "I was not wrong about the approach. Only the target." And then silence, which might have been retreat or might have been recalculation, and I was never sure which, and I suspect Reed was not either, though he never said so. Reed and Sue were married in the spring. Small ceremony outside, in a field where the soil had just started to break back through the architect's compressed aggregate, the first new growth coming up through the cracks. I stood at Reed's side, because that was what he asked me to do. I wore a suit that a very patient tailor had spent considerable effort producing for a body that most tailors would have declined to attempt. Johnny set off what I can only describe as an involuntary celebratory flare when they kissed, which startled everyone except Sue, who had clearly anticipated this and was already smiling before the light arrived. It was a good day, one of the better ones. They asked me what it was like. It was like most things that matter, I tell them. It was terrible and necessary, and I would do it again tomorrow. It cost things that cost things still. There are mornings I wake up and the mirror is a problem again, and there are nights I miss the hands I was born with in a way that doesn't have a resolution. But you carry what you carry, and you find out what you can be made into when the thing doing the making has run out of patience. And if you're lucky, you find 3 other people as strange and specific and impossible to resolve as you are, and you stand with them in the gap between what can be calculated and what cannot. The architects built worlds according to perfect geometries. They had been doing it for longer than our civilization has been counting time, and they encountered 4 people who could not be reduced to a clean variable, and they encountered the way those people refused, and they moved on. I think about that sometimes, on the hard mornings. The fact that the thing which saved us was not our strength or our firepower or our technology, but our fundamental resistance to being solved for. The way a human being, when pushed all the way to the wall, turns out to be something that none of the available equations cover. The field is still there, around what was the main structure site. Grass has come back, some trees. The aggregate is breaking down slowly into something that will be good soil in a generation or 2. Nobody builds there yet. People leave things at the edge of the old perimeter, flowers. Sometimes, notes. The kind of thing people leave at the sites of battles, the gesture that says, "We know what happened here and we know what it cost and we are not going to pretend otherwise." I went once early morning, no one else around. I stood at the edge of the field and looked at the sky, where the light was ordinary and warm and directional and had no geometry in it. I thought about Reed's voice in my earpiece. I thought about Johnny on the rock. I thought about Sue's hand on his shoulder. I put my hand in my jacket pocket and felt the absence of the crystal, which Reed has in his lab now, behind glass, labeled in his precise handwriting. And I thought, we are still here. That is not a small thing. That is, when you look at it clearly, in the plain light of a morning after the calculations have all been run, and the variables have all been accounted for, the only thing that was ever the point. We are still here.